And welcome back. Let's go ahead and continue working on our image. Now, before we move into working with our midground, we're actually going to take a step back and do a little bit more with our foreground here first. So what I did is, first thing I said is that, I realized that this layer I call background would really be more apt to call a sky layer, because that's really a more accurate description of what we have here, because our mountains are also part of that background. And if I ever want to come back and manipulate just those two elements, I don't want to necessarily merge these together. So what I'm going to do instead is take these two layers and I'm going to put them into a group and call that group background. Because that's what it'll let me do, is allow me still to independently manipulate those elements. Now this layer 1, the layer that has our bricks on it, we're just going to go ahead and call this our brick layer. I'm just going to call it brick. And I'm going to go ahead and stick that one in a folder 2 and call that folder the foreground. So now, of course, if I drag that brick layer into foreground, you can see that now is an element of foreground. All right, the next thing we want to do is add a little bit more detail to our brick elements here. A lot of times, for example, if we have things just sitting out in nature, of course, will go through and do different things such as adding grass or moss or other things that are going to happen over time. And so we're going to do that just to add a little bit more detail visually to these elements. Now, rather than painting in that grass individually, we're going to again use a pattern to help us out here. And we could, of course, use our grass pattern from things we've done before. However, those grass patterns were more suited for things such as like our world map. It's not necessarily going to suit like what we have with our bricks here. So I'm just going to go ahead and choose to make a new image here. And let's go ahead and just do something like, let's say, 36 by, let's do 16. Or 32 by 16, sorry. And Control 0 to zoom that in. And we are going to now go ahead and make our grass pattern. So the very first thing I'm going to want to do is set this up so I can, of course, have different sections, so to speak, of the grass. So I'm just going to do a marquee selection here to grab about 4 pixels here of the selection. And let's go ahead and pick a green for our grass. I'm going to choose a bit of a darker green to get started. And we're just going to go ahead and fill that section in. All right, and so now, of course, we can add our highlights and, of course, our shadow to this. Now, I might look at this and say, this selection is not quite where I want it to be. Since I'm going to be adding another layer, I'm actually just going to move this down a layer. And now that it's down 1 pixel, I can, of course, manipulate this further. I'm going to deselect this, and let's switch to our colors here. And we want to go a little bit lighter and into the yellows a little bit here to kind of get that lighter highlight color. And switching back to our brush tool, let's go ahead and paint in across that highlight color. And then we'll go ahead and grab that original color here, make that darker, and switch more into the blues a bit to grab our shadow color. And we'll go ahead and paint that one in. Now, what I want to do here is go ahead and just paint in some of these darker colors to come down. This is, of course, going to just represent some grass overhang here. And you'll notice as I'm doing this, I'm not really going below this halfway mark here because I don't really want this to go below this halfway point right now. Because, again, we're working on making this pattern here. So this is a good starting point for this. And let's go ahead and grab that highlight color. We're going to do the same thing. Just add a couple pieces here that go up. And we're going to, of course, have a couple low-hanging pieces as well. Again, just to add a little color and variation in here with our highlights and with our shadow effects. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to blend this here a little bit. I'm going to grab the original green color that I had. And I actually want to blend this up into the grass pattern a little bit. And also sometimes here a little bit into this shadow pattern. Again, that's just going to help break this up so it looks a little bit more natural and doesn't look like it's just a random collection of pixels. And if we look at this, we say we want this to look maybe a little bit better. We say, I want this dark to be just a little bit more, and we can do that. And now that I'm more comfortable with how this is starting to turn out, I'm a little more comfortable with bringing this grass pattern down, so that way it hangs even lower. So then I can actually just grab my move tool and just bring the whole shape down 1 pixel, and that's going to give me more room to work with here, especially if I say, I want more with my highlights, for example. I might say I want those highlights to maybe stick up just a little bit more so they have a little more pronounced presence here within our pattern. And again, we can just play around with this until we get to the area that we want represented properly within everything here. And so once you get to that point where everything is starting to look pretty good, we'll be able to move on to our next piece, which is adding yet one more highlight layer here. So let's grab that original color, and we're going to go even lighter this time, and actually bring it a little closer to the yellows. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and put that layer here on top, and we're just going to go ahead and paint here in a couple of these pixels, just so that we can get that nice good color variation going on. And this is mostly going to happen here near the tops. So this is where light would be coming down, hitting these pixels here. And so we might look and say, oh, here's a pixel that might be too dark, for example, and allows us to easily come in here and kind of patch up some of these here in case we say we want this to really effectively look a lot more representative here, what our end goal is. All right, that's looking pretty good to me. Only thing I might want to do now is add a shadow below my grass. So to go ahead and make this shadow effect, what we're going to actually do here is I'm first going to make a new layer. And I want to put that layer below our top layer here for our grass. And let's go ahead and we want to select this whole region here. Now, of course, if we try to click around, we could have some trouble here. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to switch here real quick to my quick selection tool. And I can grab that whole selection. I'm going to go back to layer 2, which is my new layer. So I'm just going to rename this quick as shadow, just so that way I can keep that straight. So there's my shadow layer. And I'm going to switch to my fill bucket tool. And I'm going to make this into black. And I'm just going to go ahead and fill that in. Now you don't necessarily see it here currently because it's over top of the green. But if I look over here in my thumbnails with the layers, you can see the shadow layer. Switching to my move tool, I can go ahead then and nudge this shadow layer down. And I want to nudge this down until we get it pretty much right here below at the very bottom of this image. Now, of course, this is very overpowering, so we're actually going to take that opacity of that shadow and let's just scale that down and take it a little bit under 50% here. And that's going to give us a kind of a nice shadow representation of where this grass is. So that looks pretty good there. So let's go ahead and take this and make it into a pattern. So let's go and do our old edit and define pattern. I don't have it available because I don't have my layers here selected. So let's deselect this first and do edit. Now we can define our pattern. And we are going to go ahead and call this grass background. Just because I know earlier we had done a grass pattern, so I don't want to necessarily overwrite that same name. So I'm just going to call it grass background. Click OK. And so now I should have that available for me as a pattern. So I'm just going to real quickly look at my paint bucket. If I look under my patterns, you can see here's our brick pattern. Here's our grass pattern that we have now. So to get our pattern in here, let's use our marquee tool and let's just go ahead and make a selection that's going to be above our brick. And it's going to overlap that a little bit. And let's go ahead and fill that in. Make sure we have the correct pattern here. We want our grass background pattern. And if I fill that in, right now, of course, before I do that, one thing I want to do is probably make a new layer here, just so that way I'm making sure it's not being overridden by my brick layer here. So I'm going to go ahead and call this grass. And now that that layer is there, I should be able to, with the pattern fill that in. And you can see we have a grass layer here. Now we do see there is some kind of little bit of phantom grass showing up here. If you have that happen when you do your selection, that's okay. We're just going to go ahead and use our marquee selection tool. Let's do a quick deselect. We can also see we have some overhang here from the top of the shadow image. So I'm actually going to zoom this in just a little bit here. And what I want to do now is effectively come through and just remove this layer here. So just do a selection. That's going to get rid of all that grass that's on the bottom there without removing the shadow effects that I have. Once I have that selected, I can just hit the delete key. Same thing for above. You want to make sure you just go through, select that, tap your delete key. And if I zoom that back out, and Control D, we can now, of course, have our grass pattern with our shadow effect. And if I go ahead and switch to my Move tool, I can now tap that grass pattern down, so now it sits comfortably on top of my brick. And if I want that same pattern now to be on top of this brick layer here, I can actually just use the old Alt trick here to kind of copy that on over. And I'm going to go ahead and set that on top there again. Now, of course, you notice I do have some overhang. So we can use the same trick we just did, using our marquee tool to go ahead and select that. And notice I am leaving just a little bit of a buffer there. And that's because what I want to do now is I want to zoom in on this, because I want to leave a little bit of that grass there. I just want to erase the shadow here while leaving the grass overhang, because that's going to give us kind of a nice or more natural edge there. All right, zooming that back out. All right, now these grass layers are, you notice it did make a copy, so I'm just going to merge that layer down, so now we just have one single grass layer. Now, if for some reason you looked at this and you say, this grass is not the right tone of what I want it to be, if you press Control U, that's going to bring up a hue and saturation shortcut here. And what we're going to do is if we slide the hue around, of course, that's going to allow us to change that grass into different tones. So that'll be pretty nice. Or if you want to say, hey, you know, I want this to be a little desaturated, or I want extra saturation, it allows you to, of course, make those slider values there. I'm pretty happy with how my grass is for the most part. So I'm not going to do too much with it. But that looks pretty nice. And when I click OK, it's automatically going then to apply those hue and saturation values to this grass layer. And that's going to wrap up what we have here today. So again, we did a nice little bit of touch up here on our foreground. And we come back next time. Let's go ahead and start getting ready to add more in with our midground.